calculators. So we can look at some of the sort of standard calculators like the Julie's Bicycle tools and some other tools. But really, it's important to understand what it is you're trying to do with these things. I think one of the things that goes wrong is people are told they need to do carbon measurement, and they launch into Julie's Bicycle and start filling boxes in. If they don't actually understand what it is and why things are being asked, you can end up with some very odd results. So I'm going to do a bit of a recap over what the sort of basics are, because a lot of this stuff is actually pretty simple. It's not rocket science at all. And then I'll talk through and take you through some of the features in Julie's Bicycle, and also one of the other tools, which is a spreadsheet-based tool, and some of it is Horses for Courses. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a bit about how you can actually use this to do something rather than just reporting, because obviously at the end of the day, we want to try and reduce carbon output. So sitting there and measuring it is great. It's better to measure it than not measure it. But if all we do is measure it, that isn't really, moving the plot forward. So that's the sort of outline of the plan. We'll have a short break between the first two sessions to stretch your legs and get a coffee or whatever, and then just a very brief break with some questions before the last session. So this is a little thought experiment that I've put onto the previous session, which is particularly relevant to today's session. And it's something that it's not just museums, obviously, right across the world of business, this is happening. I did a project last year for a big American software company looking at what's happening in terms of carbon accounting. And actually, it's very encouraging. It's very easy to get dispirited when you see that, that Trump might get re-elected and what's that going to do to American policy. But actually, what happens in Washington isn't really what happens in America. And I was encouraged on that project that right across corporate America, they're doing good things about, measuring and cutting their carbon and really starting to make changes. And some of the people that we all love to hate, like Amazon, are actually doing a lot of the really good stuff. So all of their web server facilities, they're rapidly decarbonizing those and improving their efficiency and taking carbon out of their operations. And so there's some good stuff going on. And what the fundamentals of this is, it's treating carbon like you treat money. You wouldn't try and run a museum without having some sort of financial budget. And you'd probably be looking at that on a pretty regular basis, certainly reporting on it monthly about how much you've spent and whether you've still got enough in the pot to see through to the end of the year. You don't just, sort of carry on blithely and hope it all works out, and then sometime after the year end, see what's left in the bank account and either go, oh, we've underspent, or oh dear, we've overspent. You track it and you monitor it and you make decisions based on what's there. And typically making decisions on how much money you've got can be quite a thing which needs quite senior approval. If you want to go and buy something expensive, you probably have to go quite a long way up the organization for sign off to say, yeah, this is the right thing to be doing with our money. And if you overspend, all hell breaks loose and questions get asked and you have to explain yourself. And very often you have to explain how you're going to recover that overspend and get back to an even keel. And if you think about how much of your time, how much management effort, and how many staff are employed to count money and to check it, and just, I'm sure all of your organizations have more accountants than you think is necessary in order to keep track of all that money. But carbon, do we do that? Do we think about that? Do we measure it as we go? Do we think when we're going to do something, is this the right decision in terms of my carbon output? And at the moment, it's usual to be doing that, but actually increasingly, that is something that businesses are starting to do. And this carbon calculation is a very first step along that road of actually measuring what's going on, and then we can start to think about what we want to do about it. So it's the beginning of a process. Some of the things I'm going to talk about are sort of pretty straightforward, but they lead on to more complicated and more sophisticated tools and abilities to make decisions. So I'm going to do a quick recap. Some of this is from the previous session. So if you've looked through that, this should be reasonably familiar to you. But if you haven't looked at that, it might be worth going back and looking at it. And what we're talking about here is overall what we're aiming for is a process. It's not a sort of one-off thing that we do once. It's an ongoing improvement process. And all of these things are sort of a cycle of measuring things, deciding what's important, looking at what the options are, possibly doing something new, making sure we've done the sums to see whether what we're doing actually makes sense, because it's easy to waste effort on things that don't actually do much good. Planning how we're going to improve them, and then implementing that and monitoring what's going on. And that takes you back to measuring it again. And so typically for these carbon calculators, they're set up and designed to run on an annual cycle, where each year you measure what's happened, you make a plan, and you try and improve for the following year, and off you go again. Now, I would argue that for a lot of things you're going to be looking at, doing it annually is way too infrequently. And it could well be that you want to have some improvement projects where actually you're measuring and calculating on a more frequent basis, so that you're starting to look at acting. And I think in the previous session I talked about things like looking at your heating system, and you want to be able to measure whether you've made a saving by maybe re-optimizing the heat in the different spaces in your building, and then seeing what that's done to the heat. And you don't want to be waiting for a whole winter until the next year. And on top of that, you obviously want to make sure that you're comparing eggs with eggs. So you don't want to cut all your thermostats and thought, haven't I done well? And then discover it just was a mild winter. And the next winter, when it's really cold, like it has been this winter, you find you're not doing so well. So this is the principle that we're trying to live within, of carrying out effectively a continuous improvement process. So those are all the various different elements within that. And it's this continuous improvement, act, measure, analyze, act, measure, analyze cycle that's a sort of standard improvement cycle. So the other thing we're going to be talking about a lot today is scopes, and scopes 1, 2, and 3, and sitting within the sort of net zero principle. So again, there's a bit of a recap on that. Net zero as a principle is quite an important one. Basically, there was a lot of greenwashing going on sort of 10 years ago or so, and lots of organizations saying they were going to be carbon neutral and that they were offsetting all of their emissions. And you had, oil companies saying they were going to be carbon neutral, which seems a bit impossible. And so actually it was an extraordinary effort. A whole lot of work was done, and a completely new suite of international standards has been developed. And these cover all of the aspects of how you account for your carbon. And it's an ongoing process. So there are a bunch of standards for all sorts of different industries, and they're being expanded all the time, so that we're moving more and more towards hard numbers and less towards rough estimates. And on top of that, there's also a very good standard that's been adopted pretty much internationally, where if you say, I'm going to be net zero by 2030, in order to say that, you need to be able to say that we've got a plan to get there. It's something the UK government could do with doing, really. But from a corporate point of view, there's now a standard by which you can have your net zero plan assessed and measured, and it's then audited effectively against that to see if you're on track. And that's really starting to take hold and have some teeth, particularly in Europe and in America. It's become quite a high-profile thing. And you've got people like the stock markets, the Security Exchange Commission, and things are now using those standards as well to assess businesses. That's all good. But then it all fits within this world of scope 1, 2, and 3. So, I mean, just a quick sort of, I don't know, I can't see Molly obviously, but the others, I mean, I think probably, Catherine, you're very familiar with this because you've been through that training process, but maybe the others less so. The principles of scope 1, 2, and 3 are: scope 1 is the things that actually emit carbon on your own site effectively, or from your own, operate directly from your own operations. So it's burning gas, burning oil for heating, it's burning fuel in any vehicles that belong to your organization. And that's basically what the main things are for your purposes. Scope 2 are emissions that come directly from things you do on site, but where the emissions are somewhere else. Basically, that means electricity. I mean, there's a few wrinkles on that, but it basically means it's electricity, because you're using electricity on site, and that's causing emissions somewhere else in the country where that electricity is being generated. Obviously, if you've got any on-site renewable generation, if you've got solar panels, that helps to cut that. And then scope 3, which is the really tricky one. This is all the indirect emissions as a result of what you do. And it's an area that was, when they were first setting up these standards, it was quite contentious, because there was an argument that this is double counting. Because if you're going to measure the emissions, for example, in all the things you buy, but also the person that sells it to you is going to measure the emissions in all the stuff they sell. So those emissions get counted twice somehow, and doesn't that mean it's wrong? And the decision was taken, I think quite rightly, that you've got to do that, because you need everybody to take responsibility for everything. Because the danger is otherwise, if you were to say that the people that manufacture things have to take responsibility for the manufactured carbon, but the people that buy them don't, any organisation that wants to make itself look good would just separate off all those high carbon activities to another company and leave it there, and then they'd be able to say, look how green we are. So this is something that the oil and gas industry are trying to sort of wriggle their way out of at the moment. You'll have seen there were figures being quoted to say that it's really important that we have our own natural gas from our own wells in the North Sea, because natural gas from our own wells has a quarter of the carbon footprint of natural gas that we bring in from abroad, which is complete nonsense. I mean, what they've done is they've looked not at the carbon in the gas, they've just said how much carbon is emitted getting the gas out of the ground and transporting it to your home, and completely ignored the carbon associated with burning that gas to heat your home. So that's why these rules are important, because they sort of avoid the sort of misleading approaches. And when it comes to your carbon reporting, these are the three things that you're going to want to be measuring and reporting on to see how you're doing and to look for areas of improvement. And I'm going to take you through how that can use as a tool in your operation. So very.
John, you're a bit glitchy. Could you just repeat that last bit, please?
And even within the World Museums, it's going to vary much on propose that you probably have quite high or if or I don't know, on that story museum.
John? John?
If you've got very sensitive on the environmental, that's going to boost.
Is it just me? Or is it everybody? John? John? Is it just me, Catherine, or is it everybody?
No, I can't hear him. He dipped out very crackly and got about one word in 10.
Yeah, same here. John, we missed quite a bit of that since the beginning of the slide. It disappeared for a bit and went very crackly. Can you hear me, John?
Try that again.
Sorry, we missed all of that slide. It's gone a bit crackly. Sorry,
I think I'm back now. Something glitched there somewhere.
Could you start the beginning of that slide again? Is that all right?
Yes, so absolutely fine. So this is just showing that different organisations have very different sort of patterns of carbon footprint split between the different areas that they use it. And I mean, this is showing you a sort of a manufacturer versus a school. But I mean, the same will be true even within the museum world. So if you're like a railway museum, then it's likely you're going to have quite a high level of carbon emissions just from your day-to-day activities, because it involves burning coal. compared with, say, I don't know, the Storey Museum in Oxford, where you're just a building. And if you've got a lot of sensitive artifacts that need climate control and management, again, that's going to boost your energy use for that. But this is looking at some of the different elements. And again, one of the key things museums is the Scope 3 emissions associated with the people visiting the museum. So that how they get there and what their mode of travel is quite an important part of that. And obviously, you want to encourage lots of people to come to your museum, but if you're a sort of a really nationally important museum, I know, like the British Museum, if you've got people flying from all over the world specifically to come and see your museum, that's going to be rather problematic for your carbon footprint. So big range of different types of different balances, and it's important to understand this, because obviously you're going to want to put your time and effort into the things that will make a difference to your carbon footprint. So in terms of the how you're going to measure these, Scope 1 and 2, which are probably your biggest emissions, I'll come on to that, but I mean that's fairly straightforward. That's about your bills. And Scope 3 will look through some of the main areas in there. So a bit of travel, some purchasing, there's your sort of water supply and waste disposal, and we'll run through that. If we look at some sort of typical figures for some different types of buildings, it's going to vary enormously from organisation to organisation, depending on how you're heated, whether it's gas or oil. If it's electric heating, then that's going to push your cost of electricity. And so we're going to start by really looking at these core energy uses within your organisation. I'm sort of talking about, I'm going to be talking about energy in kilowatt hours. So there's a basic bit of sort of science in there, which is unavoidable, which is trying to get your units right. I get very sort of uncomfortable if people start talking about, the wrong units. We're very loose about units in our society. If someone says to you, how far away is it to the shops? And they say, it's about 5 minutes. That's no good. That's not a distance, is it? That's a time. It doesn't take into account whether you're on a bicycle or walking or whatever. So when you're talking about energy, we want to be talking about kilowatt hours. And a kilowatt hour is a kilowatt that's been left on for an hour. So if you're old enough like me and you remember the old electric bar heaters, you used to have one bar was 1 kilowatt. Most of you won't even remember that. But if you turn, say, an electric heater on that's a 1 kilowatt heater, if you leave it on for an hour, that's going to have used 1 kilowatt hour of energy. And it's the difference between the energy that's being used over time and how fast it's using it. A kilowatt is measuring how quickly it uses the energy. So you could have some things that are quite high energy users. So, for example, if you've got an electric shower in your house, your electric shower is probably 9 or 10 kilowatts, but you don't leave it on all day. Well, I hope you don't. In the shorter the shower you have, the less energy you will have used. So getting the distinction is important. Then we get into some really quite complicated units where we're trying to look at what the carbon is that's been emitted for delivering that energy. And then we get into this unit of grams or kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's a unit that really needs to have a new name. There's been various proposals to try and come up with a new name for the unit, but of course no one can agree who to name it after. There's some that think we ought to name it after Greta Thunberg, but others don't seem to like her anymore. But yeah, so we're going to be talking quite a lot about kilowatt hours as energy, and also about grams or kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. And the little equivalent bit, the little E or sometimes an EQ, is important because some of the things we do, there's more than just direct carbon dioxide. And a good example of that is if you've got a gas stove and you light the gas to put your kettle on, actually, when you're burning gas, same is true in a boiler, some of that gas is escaping as methane. So actually, the carbon equivalent emissions for using a gas stove are much higher than the direct emissions of burning the gas, because some of it escapes as methane, and methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas. And the other thing that you'll see is in some of the numbers is that because we're trying to do a sort of holistic, what's the total carbon associated with this, that's also built into it. So when you look at the numbers for mains gas, for example, at 182 grams or 0.182 kilograms, that number is more than the direct carbon from burning that much gas, because in getting the gas from out of the ground to you, some of that methane is lost through flaring and through leaks and so on, and so that's built in. So that number we're going to use, which we call a carbon factor, is effectively a nice conversion factor to convert how much of whatever it is you've used into carbon emitted. And in the case of things like electricity bills, we do it per kilowatt. If it's, if you're buying petrol to put in your car, you can do it per litre of petrol and so on. And part of what we're going to be talking about is what tools you're going to use to do those sums for you. So just starting with electricity, I don't know why I'm starting with electricity, it's probably the most complicated, but never mind, we'll start with electricity. Electricity is complicated because, and this causes lots of confusion. The carbon content, effectively, of electricity is a product of where it's come from, which at any time on any given day is going to be a mixture of power from nuclear power stations. There's going to be some energy from wind turbines. There's probably a bit of solar power if it's in the middle of the day. And whatever we can't get from those, we make up by burning gas in gas-fired power stations. And this is what they call gas peaking. It's using gas power stations to make up the difference between all of the other energy sources we've got and what's being demanded on the grid at the time.
A few noises off. So what I'm trying to explain is about the graph that we've got here on the right-hand side of this slide, which is really just showing you that how much carbon there is in electricity moves around all the time. So the line at the top was from the 17th of November when it was very still and there was not much wind power. And so what we're having to do there is burn gas in power stations to make up the difference. So we've got the electricity, we've got a base load of nuclear power, which isn't really variable, it's just there all the time. You've got the wind power, which we can't, we can turn it down if there's more than we need, but we can't turn it up if there's no wind. And whatever the shortfall is made up by burning gas. And on this day, when it was relatively still, we had quite a high level of gas being burnt, so we've got high carbon. And at the bottom of the lines, that grey line, that was back in April last year when it was very windy, and we were burning very little gas, so the electricity was very low carbon. And what this means is that for electricity, the carbon intensity isn't just a single number that's fixed forever. Because it would get very complicated if we were trying to track it in real time, what we do is each year, the government produces a forecast of what they think the carbon intensity will be, and that's then used for the standard reporting purposes. So for 2023, last year, the number that was provided actually was 225 grams or 0.225 kilograms. At the end of the year, the actual number was about 1.157, so 0.157. So it was actually quite a pessimistic forecast that they tend to use. And this little graph here, what this is showing what the blue line is showing what the carbon content of the electricity grid has been from 2010, and then that's going through about now through to where we're going to get to by 2050. And by 2050, the carbon on the electricity will be almost nil because we won't be using any fossil fuels to generate electricity. And what this means is because electricity grid is being decarbonised quite quickly, there's a lot of emphasis to move away from burning gas into using electricity because of this. Now, from a reporting point of view, all we need to do really is to see what the number is that the government has set for this year and use that for this year's reporting. And then next year it'll be a different number and so on. But it does sometimes cause confusion because you get people saying, oh, no, but we've signed up for a green tariff. So our electricity is 100% green electricity. Now, it is true that it's a good idea to sign up for a green tariff, but that doesn't mean there's no carbon in your electricity. The electricity you're receiving is the electricity the grid is providing, and the carbon content is set by that. If you were to argue that maybe the people who buy green tariffs should be allowed to count that towards their carbon emissions, all it means is that all the other people would then have to put more and more carbon on theirs because it's a zero-sum game. The amount of carbon that's emitted to generate the electricity is what it is, and all you're doing is dividing it up differently. And it comes back to people say, well, what's the point in having a green tariff? Well, the reason of having a green tariff is that makes green electricity more valuable to generators, and that encourages people to generate more green electricity. So it is doing some good. And if you go back 10 years, it did a lot of good. It's one of the things that really kick-started renewable energy generation. But you could argue now that it makes less of a difference because actually the grid is being decarbonised by national policy. So actually the consumer demand element is less of a driver. But the key message really is that this is one of the carbon factors that's going to change year on year. It's not going to be a fixed number that just stays the same. And the fossil fuels you burn, if it's gas or if it's oil or whatever, then that's more straightforward because that more or less stays the same. I've been doing this sort of presentation for people for a while, and I've been confidently stating that that the carbon in gas doesn't change, and then they actually changed the carbon factors for gas last year, and that was because they'd reassessed the impact of methane leakage and some of the carbon emissions associated with recovering gas from the ground and getting it to its point of use, and so the gas did change slightly. But fundamentally, these numbers are more or less constant from year to year. And of course, if you're able to use some biomass, I'll come back to that because I've used an example museum that has a biomass boiler. Then provided that's sustainably sourced, then that can be treated as zero carbon. Is the sound coming through all right now? Good. So that's scopes 1 and 2. Scope 3 is where it gets quite tricky because on scope 3, we've got to start thinking about the carbon embodied in the things that we're buying, and also the carbon that's a result of the things that we're selling and the associated transport and travel to do with that. And travel obviously is a good chunk of it because for most museums, you want people to travel to your museum. So that's a chunk of your scope 3 emissions. You've also got water and sewage, which is very dull and actually is quite small. So it's not something to obsess over. And waste is another important thing where the way in which you dispose of your waste has quite a big impact, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail. And this is really where having a calculator helps to add value. I'm going to look through some of the calculations in a minute, but this is where it starts to add value. And purchasing is also quite difficult at the moment. I think it's going to become a little bit easier. We're moving away from moving towards a situation where there's becoming more of an expectation that when you produce a manufactured product and sell it to somebody, one of the things they want to know is what's the embodied carbon in it. So in the car industry, for example, all suppliers of components into vehicle manufacturing have to deliver with their product a thing called a total life cycle carbon assessment. And that then goes into a roll-up so that the car manufacturer then can build up what the total embodied carbon in the car is from all the bits that have gone into it. And that's now quite a sophisticated and well thought through process, and is starting to drive design behaviors. Vehicles are being designed with lower embodied carbon by selecting suppliers that can reduce their carbon. And so, for example, one of the things we're seeing is manufacturers are moving manufacturing back from having outsourced it to the Far East and now bringing it back to Europe or back to America, because that reduces the carbon embodied in the components. So that's starting to happen. And from your point of view, the sorts of things you're likely to be buying are probably things where they still don't bother to do that. But it doesn't do any harm to ask the question when if you're buying through a big stationer, some stationery, saying, well, okay, so here are my options on buying printer paper. What's the embodied carbon in the different printer papers? What are my choices? And you will start to find that actually people are answering those questions, as some of the suppliers are starting to provide that data. So I'll sort of rattle through that as a sort of background before we get on to looking at the actual calculators. Has that sort of prompted any questions so far? Is there any that I've gone over too quickly that you'd like me to just do again or whatever? I'm just saying I can't see the chat at the moment. I'm going to get the chat to pop out, and I can't see how to do that at the moment. But if there's anything, if Molly, you had anything you wanted to put in the chat, and I don't know if Alex, you can see the chat.
Yeah, I've got the chat open. I have a quick question. The figures you gave us for like oil and gas, in terms of the carbon released per kilowatt hour, presumably if we're using a calculator, so say one of the available calculators, they use those figures. Do they state what or do they state within their kind of calculator what figures they're using?
Yes, they're all of the calculators you'll find have a source that will tell you what figures they're using. I'll come on and cover that. They might obviously if it's your oil, if you're on oil heating, then you're going to be buying oil in litres, and they'll offer you the opportunity to put that number in as per litre, because that's what we're measuring. I used kilowatt hours just so there was a comparison available between the different heating alternatives. But yeah, so the calculators will ask you for it in whatever the units are that it's supplied, and things like water and sewage. Your water bill will tell you your water usage in litres or in meters cubed, which you can put into the calculators.
Great, thank you, Catherine.
Catherine, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just interested that the figures you gave for mains gas and mains electricity in terms of grams of carbon are the same as 2022 for 2023. Would you expect them to have gone down or changed?
2023 didn't really go down from 2022 much. It should have. You'd have thought it would have gone down more, but we had we've slightly had a pause in the expansion of offshore wind in terms of new offshore wind coming on stream. And also we've lost some nuclear. And in fact, one of the challenges over the next few years in that forecast is that they're well behind with the new nuclear coming on stream. And if they do decommission on the current timetable, we're going to have a hole. And we'll end up with worse carbon in electricity because we'll have to use more gas. So that's something they're having to reconcile at the moment. I mean, I think logically they'll end up just extending the life of the old nuclear power stations a bit longer, but I don't know what the ins and outs of that are. But
because on your electricity graph there was a peak in little peak in electricity for this year. I just wonder what was predicted was going to happen this year, that electricity demand was going to go up.
Yes, if we go back to that, what we want to here. I'm overshot now.
Yeah, that one. So it looks like on the blue line there's a little peak.
There is, that's because that was the decommissioning of one of the big nuclear power stations.
Ah, right.
And a slight pause, just as a natural development cycle in the offshore wind that's coming on. I mean, there's a whole policy area of being worked on around the decarbonisation of the grid. Unfortunately, the Select Committee on Climate Change their recent, I mean, they do a tremendously good job, and their reports are splendid. And if you're interested at all in the sector, it's worth looking at their reports, because they're brilliantly written and really clear in their presentation, if somewhat depressing at times. And we are running behind in terms of meeting that target through various policy initiatives. The complete ban on onshore wind that we've had has been a major problem in terms of targets, because it's really pushed back what we ought to be able to do. And we're also running behind in terms of balancing. There was meant to have been quite a lot of work done around looking at how we're going to balance the grid as we move away from using gas. And a lot of that work got derailed by the oil and gas industry. But they sort of derailed a whole lot of work by effectively taking over the Hydrogen Commission and putting a lot of their own people into it. Ended up with the chair resigning because he was so unhappy with the way it was being pushed, unfortunately. And part of the background to them getting these oil and gas licenses has been their very heavy lobbying that we need gas right the way through to 2050, because how else are we going to keep the lights on? And unfortunately, they've been able to sway the opinions of the key politicians. And it's, yeah, if you go back 10 years, that there was no question that we would have completely stopped using oil and gas by then. But weirdly, that suddenly now it looks like we need it again. But that's just part of the general landscape of we live in, that you've got a very large and powerful and rich industry that's threatened by decarbonisation, and is sort of thrashing about to maintain its survival. But yeah, but that's all sort of big picture stuff that we needn't worry ourselves with when we're just trying to measure our own small carbon emissions. So if we trundle on a bit again, I think where are we now in time? So we're 40 odd minutes in. Let's just take a very short break. If we take sort of a 5-minute break and restart at say 11, would that be okay? And then we'll dive into what's actually happening in the it says 10 minutes there, but I don't think I'm going to allow recording it, and we'll go on to the next slide. Let's see if we can make the technology work better in the second half. So when it comes to using the calculators, I'm going to take you through some of the sort of free tools, simple ways of doing it. And then we'll spend a bit of time looking at Julie's Bicycle Creative Climate, because in effect, that's the sort of default for museums as part of the sort of reporting that Arts Council want to see, and so on. And then I'll have a little look at some of the paid tools, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, because a lot of the paid tools are quite sophisticated and expensive and really designed for much larger organizations. There may come a time when actually it becomes the expectation that some of your sort of host organizations, those are your part of local authorities or whatever, you may find you get a sort of a calculation tool imposed upon you by your sort of host organization, because I think there is a move to try and get local authorities measuring better. They're actually behind, really, because they were reporting on carbon, and then there was a rejig under the second Conservative, or when the coalition ended, they did a rejig of reporting, and bizarrely local authorities just fell off and weren't required to report at all. I don't know whether it was oversight or what, because the central government departments still had to report. But yeah, and I think that will come back in as a requirement. So let's start just by looking at the sort of the simple stuff. I mean, the cheapest thing to do is just to do your own sums. And for a lot of what you're looking at, it really isn't rocket science. you know, in terms of scope 1, as we're looking, you're literally just taking your electricity bill and your gas bill and looking at how many kilowatt hours you bought and multiplying it by the intensity factor, 0.18 for gas and 0.225 for electricity last year. And that gives you a carbon emitted in kilograms. And in terms of the other sort of scope 1 and 2, the other thing that might be on there is if you have some vehicles that are operated by your organization. And again, that's pretty straightforward. If you've got how many litres of fuel was bought, you just take that and multiply it by the carbon intensity. Diesel's a bit higher than petrol. It's as simple as that. And you've got your carbon emitted from that. So on one level, some of that can be done really as a very simple exercise. And what we're then sort of trying to think about is at what point does it become worth you actually engaging with one of the tools? And really, I think the main driver is when you're trying to then look at the scope 3 emissions, because that gets more complicated. And you've then got to include things like staff travel and staff commuting, and critically visitor travel, which is quite a major part of it. And what you're then trying to look at is some sort of balance between accuracy and effort. If you get to the point where you're being required to report through some sort of more rigid standards, then some of that will get imposed. But actually, at the moment, I think for most organisations, there's a level of freedom to make some decisions about how accurate you want to be and how much work it's going to be to do that work. And so, for example, one of the things that is an important element of the accuracy is if we look at journeys and think about types of transport, the government produces tables every year, and we can look at those to see what carbon factors we should be using. And this is just a sort of this is all in relating it back to passenger miles. So, as I was saying just a minute ago, if you've got your own vehicle fleet and you actually know how much fuel was bought, then you know accurately what the carbon emissions is just by multiplying the amount of fuel by the carbon factor, and that'll give you a very accurate number. But if you're talking about travel from staff, or if you're talking about visitors, you're not going to know exactly how many litres of petrol were used for a journey. That's not being measured in that way. So you do need to use one of these estimates of what would be a typical carbon emissions per passenger mile. In terms of the number of miles, so for a car, if you've got 2 people in it, you can halve that number, or 3 people, you can divide it by 3 or whatever. Whereas the bottom half, from bus downwards, that's per passenger mile, so that's just per person. Obviously, the difference being that with a bus, you're assuming that it's a certain level of occupancy. The problem with these sort of averaged values is they don't really help you distinguish between different subsections within that. So, I mean, the classic thing is that for a car, it's just giving you one number, whether it's diesel or petrol or whatever. You'll have noticed earlier that I was saying that diesel has a higher carbon per litre than petrol does. But of course, diesel cars tend to use less fuel per mile travelled. And in the sort of the main sort of estimates and averaging out, they come out more or less the same. But actually, they're not, of course. If you're driving a small compact vehicle like a Nissan Micra, instead of being at 264, you're actually down at 144. Whereas if you're driving around in a Range Rover, you're up at 304. So there's quite a big difference. And on their factors, they say an electric car is 0.088. So it's a good low number. But that's that low partly because a lot of electric cars tend to be small. If you're driving around in a Tesla Type X sort of SUV, actually your carbon emissions are not very different from a petrol Nissan Micra. So it's a bit of a weakness in the approach that it's just an average number. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that towards the end of the session. But one of the problems with averaging numbers is actually it doesn't help you act to make improvements, because it doesn't distinguish between different choices and what they might do for the numbers. So if you want to encourage people to travel on lower carbon transport, you want to be able to distinguish between the different options. I mean, what is certainly true is that if people are using public transport, that's going to be better. But it's noticeable that even a typical electric car is probably lower carbon than currently a typical local bus, which is diesel powered. And of course, that's changing because we're gradually moving across from diesel to electric buses. Norwich has just got a whole lot of new electric buses. Provided they don't keep catching fire, it'll all be fine. Still don't quite know what happened with that one in London, but that's going to make quite a big difference to buses. And obviously the trains are low carbon because a lot of them are electric driven. And just on that, it's interesting that there's a new calculator that's been launched. In fact, they've launched it and then they've slightly paused, and it's going to be rolled out this summer from it's RDG, it's the Rail Delivery Group, I think they're called. And what they've done is rather than just taking a national average for all rail journeys, they're now producing a more sophisticated tool that will look at what type of rolling stock is on the line you're using. So in my case, if I get a train down to London on the electrified main line, that has a much, much lower carbon than if I get the little putt-putt train that goes across to Peterborough on a diesel, it's a sort of 2-car diesel train. And that the mainline electrified routes are about half that figure, and the sort of small diesel ones are several times it. So that again will be a more accurate thing and will help people to make good decisions. You probably don't fly people around the world very much in your sector, but obviously, as you can see, from a carbon point of view, flights are pretty bad. There was someone who was talking about it the other day, saying, "Oh well, I'd read that taking a short haul flight in economy was better than driving that. If you've got a very profligate car like a Range Rover, you are better flying to Paris than driving there in a Range Rover, but neither is a terribly green option compared to going on the train." So yeah. So that's one of the elements that you're going to be wanting to assemble. And as we look at the calculators, you'll see that what they're doing is providing you with a tool to be able to build up from the various journey information you've got to give you a number for the carbon. The other things that were on that sort of scope 3, water and sewage is a pretty trivial one, really. Your water bill, if you're on a meter, will tell you what your water usage is. If you're not on a meter, then the tools provide us with guidance to help you estimate it. And for reasons I can't quite work out, they say we'll just assume that the waste that comes back down the sewage is 90% of the water that was supplied. I'm not sure where the rest goes, but anyway, I was wondering how much you drink, but I suppose Kathy was pointing out that my wife was pointing out that if you wash clothes and then hang them out to dry, that's water that doesn't go back down the sewage. But anyway, that's the standard number. And then the government numbers, I was looking back, they haven't really changed very much. And they're 0.177 kilograms for the water supplied per meter cubed and 0.201 for the sewage. And I'll show you some numbers in a minute on these bicycles. You'll see that actually this is a very, very small amount of carbon in terms of your overall operations. So it's not really a major concern. It's good to save water, for all sorts of reasons, but it's not really going to have a big impact on your carbon emissions. The other element of waste is the stuff that you throw away. And this is something that quite a few organisations have spent quite a lot of time and effort on looking at their waste and looking at their recycling and trying to work out what they can do to improve it. And this does also have some impact in terms of carbon. I mean, if you look at general waste to landfill, if it's just broad general waste, it's about 300 kilograms a ton. The problem is, do you know how many tons of waste you produce? That's the more tricky thing, and it depends on your waste collection. If you're large enough that you have your own waste collection contract with a waste contractor, I think they're actually obliged to provide you with this data. They're meant to record what weight of waste they take of the different types and provide you with it as part of an annual report. So that may be something that's worth following up and finding out. But if it's actually just part of a broader contract that either through the council or whatever, then it may be quite difficult to obtain this information. And of course, if you do some recycling, that can be good. So paper to recycling is minus 547 kilograms a ton, and aluminium to recycling is nearly minus 10,000 kilograms per ton, which is great, isn't it? Except that you can only start to use those numbers if you also account for what you buy. And this is another thing which I've seen, organizations that are taking the benefit of recycling and not bothering to count the carbon when they bought the stuff in the first place. So yes, minus 547 for recycled paper, but it's 882 kilograms per ton for the paper when you bought it. So the difference between the two is effectively the carbon associated with taking that paper and recycling it and returning it to a useful state. If you put it into landfill, then you have to write off all of the carbon embodied in it. And as you'll see with aluminium, although aluminium has a lot of value for recycling, it's extremely expensive in carbon to produce it in the first place. And you need to be careful about what things you motivate. Some years ago, I mean a long time ago now probably, there was some of the early sort of days of trying to encourage people to recycle. It was a slightly misguided thing where people wanted to encourage people to recycle their aluminium cans. And some of you will be old enough to remember that, going around with the magnet and working out which ones you could take to school for recycling. And the intention was that this would be good because it would result in higher recycling rates for aluminium. What actually happened was both Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola stopped producing steel cans and switched all of their production to aluminium cans because the public demanded cans they could recycle. And aluminium production worldwide went up markedly, which is just one example of the unintended consequences that so often follow oversimplistic actions. But and that's, so we want to make sure we're actually taking the whole picture. So it's important to think about what the carbon in the things you buy is before you start to count any benefits in the carbon on things you recycle. And generally in things you purchase, as I said previously, you need to take account of everything that you buy, the consumables, things you buy to sell on through a shop or food in the cafe, and also, of course, any capital items or new exhibitions, that sort of project. If you're doing any sort of new exhibiting, and that's becoming an area where there's much more awareness now. So there's a really strong understanding of the need to reuse exhibition materials. There are exhibition companies now that will provide you with materials that are designed to be reused rather than being single use, and that's a really important change. So that because obviously if you can reuse something, then you don't have to buy a new thing, and that has a massive impact on the carbon. Reuse is by far the most effective thing you can do in terms of cutting carbon on purchases. And if you can reuse and repurpose, that's better than recycling, really. And this is also where some of the structured tools can help, because they will help you both find the correct factors to use, provide you with the estimates you need to estimate the carbon associated with it. And the other thing they do, which is quite a good thing, is they provide you with a structure that means you're unlikely to omit something, because they prompt you to ask for all the things they think you ought to be able to report on. it makes it easier to make sure you've not emitted some significant source of carbon. So some of that you can work out for yourself, but in practice, what we'll end up doing for most of us is using one of the sort of tools that's available to help us. And in this sector, then obviously we're going to try and use one of the free tools because we haven't got any money. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus mostly on two. There are others, but actually I think at the moment the two main ones that I think are the ones that do everything that you need to do properly and are reasonably reliable are the ones that the Scottish Gallery Climate Coalition have produced. And the other one we'll look at is the Creative Climate Tools from Julie's Bicycle. And really, the choice between the two, to some extent, is going to come down to your own preference in what things work better for you. The Gallery Climate Coalition is a set of spreadsheets. They're well thought through spreadsheets, and we're going to look at them in a minute. And if you're familiar with spreadsheets and you're comfortable with using them, I think you'll find that that's quite a good tool to use. Whereas Julie's Bicycle is a web interface where it prompts you to enter information, and it basically leads you by the nose through all the various things you need to do. But I find it gets very tedious very quickly because there's a lot of repetitive data entry. It doesn't really help you. I mean, one of the things we'll look at, which I find really frustrating, is it provides you with a tool to enter all your travel data for your organisation into a spreadsheet to add it all up for you. But then when it comes to putting it onto the website, you have to enter all the data manually. There's no way of uploading your data from your spreadsheet, which just seems barking mad. And then I think the Gallery Climate Coalition is a fairly simple tool in terms of a spreadsheet, but Julie's Bicycle should have something a bit cleverer, but it doesn't. It uses pretty simplistic conversions. It doesn't really distinguish between, I mean, for example, it just uses a single number for car. It doesn't say, is it a big car or a little car, or actually, which car is it? I mean, it'd be very easy for it to link into a database where you actually told it which car it was. There's actually open access now. You can just put in a number plate and it'll pull up the specific data for that vehicle. But so that I get a bit frustrated with Julie's Bicycle because I don't think they're really trying quite hard enough. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and, if I can find where you've gone. Where are you? There you are. Where's my stop share button? When it's up there now. I'm going to stop sharing on there. This is all going to get very confusing. I'm now going to come out of my presentation. Seems to have worked. I have no idea where you are now, but I'm assuming you're there. So, oh, there you are. That's it. You're still there. And I'm going to pull up on the screen Julie's Bicycle. I'm going to try and share that screen again. This is really advanced students only. This is. Oh, I pressed the wrong button. Share screen. There we go. And I think I want to share that one. So if I've done it right, you should now be able to see Julie's Bicycle Climate Creative Tools.
Yes, we can.
Which is just a web page. Find where my mouse has gone. I should be able to move down. So this is what Julie's Bicycle looks like. Have any of you used Julie's Bicycle before or had a look at it? I'm getting shaking heads. I'll assume that Molly's shaking her head. So it's set up as it's very much a sort of web interface type thing that looks quite nice and touch and feely. And you've got summary results and things, and you can click on things, and they do WYSI active stuff, which is quite nice. It's quite pretty. And what you're doing is you're putting in your data for it to then produce this summary. So this is just based on a sort of an example museum. It's actually based broadly on the Museum of the Dales up in the Yorkshire Dales. Don't want Microsoft update. Right. And so you can see that in terms of the overall carbon footprint, it's actually dominated by audience travel. It's partly because this is a countryside museum where there isn't very good public transport. So most people would have to drive there. There's another chunk, which is the energy, which is mostly heating the building and a bit of lighting. You'll see that water and sewage is tiny, very little there. There's some waste, and there's a bit of business travel because I made some assumptions that they might go off to some conferences here and there, and you'll see that. But so behind this, what this is based on is the data that goes in. So I'm going to edit a footprint, which is going to confuse, it's going to upset it because this is last year's, and it says it don't want to do that because we've already submitted it. But I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. And so this is the sort of interface with which you're going to put your data in. So along the top, you've got various categories of energy. So generally, you're just saying what year is it, and you can define your building. So if you've got more than one building, you put several buildings in, and the building, its size and shape and how it's heated and so on. And then the main things you're going to do is tell it how much electricity you use, how much gas you use, and those are just the numbers off your bills. And then there's various other options on here. Unfortunately, it doesn't have biomass. This particular museum has a biomass boiler. It doesn't give you that option. It doesn't cover that. So I've had to put it as biodiesel, which is a bit of a fudge, and an oil. And also, if you've got on-site renewable energy, that goes in there. If you've got solar panels or whatever. It also has a section to estimate the impact of home working, which is quite useful. And this is really the strength of these tools, I guess, is that there's quite a lot of assumptions and estimates you have to make to come up with what the sort of carbon impact of people having to heat their homes to work from home. And this will do all that for you in a reasonably robust way. It's based on sort of government data sets that have been produced because they're a reliable estimate. And it will do all of that for you. But they also have the ability in all of those things just to put other things in. So if there's something it doesn't cover, it always provides you with the ability to add it as an additional line item for something that it didn't know about or hasn't covered. So that's sort of energy. Water, you're just basically saying how much water you've used. Similarly for waste. Now for waste, it's giving you all sorts of different options that you can have collected. So if you've got just general waste going to landfill in tons, that will have one thing. You can have paper, you have cans and plastic. And in here, you've got a lot of options of things that you might use. I mean, I don't know how many museums have a lot of rubble as waste or scrap metal, but and it also covers some things like solvents and some of the more specialist ones. So that's really helpful because you haven't got to sort of think about it and try and look up numbers. It provides it all to you in a nice, easy format. Then your audience travel. And this is really where you're going to have to make some assumptions about the data for your audience and how many of them walk, how many of them cycle, do you have lots of coach trips that come in and so on. And you're then going to put in there some assumptions around that. I've just left this at the moment as all the default figures and which it will do. And I've just told it how many people came to this museum in a year. And it's just then takes a set of typical assumptions for it. And again, one of the strengths of this type of calculator is where you don't know what the answer is, it will provide you with a sensible estimate. So you don't just have a gap and you just don't know what to put in it. So that makes it very user-friendly, particularly when you're doing this for the first time. It makes it quite friendly. And it may be that one of the things that you're going to do is start running visitor surveys to find out how people came. And if you're a city centre museum near the station and on good bus routes, you might find that actually these assumptions that go into here, and you can see the assumptions, you can click through and go and look at them, are pessimistic. And you might say, well, actually, we're better than that. And you may then want to run a campaign over a season of encouraging people to travel by public transport. And there's tools you can use. I don't know if any of you have seen, there's a thing called Good Journeys, Has anyone seen that? So Good Journeys is a tool that's been set up where you can offer people benefits. Sometimes it's discounted entry. Some of the stingy museums just give you a free cup of coffee. But if you travel by public transport to get there, you show your travel ticket and you get a discounted entry, or you get some other benefit. And it's managed through this scheme called Good Journeys. And that provides support information as well to help you market this to people. So what you're then doing is you're encouraging your visitors to travel to you in a way that's lower carbon, which is great to do. But of course, if you're just using assumed averages for the numbers you then use for your carbon reporting, it doesn't matter how many people come by bus and train, it's not going to make any difference to your calculation. So you're not going to see the benefit. You're not going to actually distinguish the outputs from your actions. And this is where it's important that you understand the limitations of the averaged information. And we're going to talk about this a bit more at the end of the session. So that's the sort of the interface you're working to. And then similarly for business travel, you can say what the journey was, how you traveled, how far it was, and so on. And it'll work out, and how many people were in the vehicle. And I've put some in here, and I've assumed it was one conference that some staff went to in Munich, just to mix it up a bit. And then the other item is fleet travel. If you've got vehicles that are a part of a fleet, if you've got vans or whatever, then you can put those in. So that's the sort of interface for putting it in. Now, obviously, in terms of things like the sort of travel, business travel, if you've got an organisation of any size, even if you've got only 5 or 6 people, and you're trying to keep track of all the travel they've done, it can add up to quite a lot of transactions, quite a lot of lines. And so they do provide a scheme for you to put all this information into a spreadsheet through the year to build it all up into a pattern. So you're not having to do this every time anyone travels anywhere. But it's quite laborious. And then at the end of that, what it then provides you with doesn't actually enable you to upload it. As I said earlier, I'm just going to stop that share, and I'm going to share. But what I'm going to share, I think I can just share that whole screen, and then that's going to work better. So on here, if I go back behind, I think you can see that spreadsheet now. So this is the summary of all the various travel.
Could you make that a bit bigger? I'm only on
laptop.
I'm
just going to see how I can do that. Just check I've got the right one here. Yeah. So let's just go bigger with that, and let's go bigger on here. Is that looking a bit more like you can see it? How's that?
Yeah,
that's a bit more visible.
Much better.
Yeah. So this is the Julie's Bicycle spreadsheet. So here's the summary of all the information that you put in, and you've then got tabs that you can put in each, like a list of flights and a list of car journeys and a list of taxi journeys, and so it goes on. It also does a thing for overnight accommodation, which is quite useful because it does a quick estimate of that. And then along the bottom, you've got bus, ferry, train, tram, tube, minibus, motorbike, people carrier. And it will then produce this summary sheet where you've got, how many, what was the total cars and so on. And it does mean that it then, rather than having to type in one at a time all of the journeys into the Julie's Bicycle website, you just put all of these in as an aggregate for the whole year. So for a diesel car, you just take how many kilometers it was for everybody for the whole year, and it works it all out from there. But you still have to basically pick up these numbers and type them in manually into the website, which I find a bit frustrating. But I'd say, that provided you've got a reasonable tolerance for manual data entry, Julie's Bicycle is easy to use. It's robust in the sense that it supports you through the process and puts sensible estimates in where you don't know the answer. And so you'll get a sensible answer out at the end of it. It's quite hard to do it wrong. And then, of course, the other key thing about Julie's Bicycle's creative climate tools is that if you're involved in Arts Council funding and so on, it's something they ask for. And so actually it then makes it easy for you to upload that to the Arts Councils to fill in the information they want. Having said that, if you find it painful to use and don't want to use it, you don't actually have to. You can use a different tool, calculate all your carbon, and then just put it into Julie's Bicycle as a single number to upload it, and that does work. So you're not locked into having to do it line by line in Julie's Bicycle. You can, and I'll just show you if I now go to if I just that one. If I go back into here, so this is the Creative Carbon Scotland tool, and this isn't a website. This is a series of spreadsheets that you just download and can use. And there's a couple of things about this that are different from Julie's Bicycle. One of them is this is set up right from the start on the assumption that what you're doing is you're setting a budget for the year, and then you're managing and reporting against that budget. Whereas Julie's Bicycle doesn't have any sort of budgeting tool at all. It's just a calculator. It doesn't say whether what you've come out with is good or bad or better than, you know, it'll provide some annual year-to-year comparisons, but it's not really designed to be a management tool. Whereas Creative Carbon Scotland tool is set up specifically to enable you to do that. And again, I'll make this a bit bigger. So this is the sort of main top level of it, where it's looking at your, and it runs on a 3-year rolling basis. So this would, if I put all the data in, which I haven't, this would be showing 2021, 22, 21, 22, 22, 23, and then showing you what had happened in terms of electricity. So that's energy and water, waste, travel. And then you can also do it for a breakdown against different elements of your operation. So this is designed to have what they call overhead, which is sort of management-y type stuff, regular, which is an ordinary operations, and then special, which is things like events and special exhibitions, so that you can also get a bit of a breakdown in different types of your activity. Which again, Julie's Bicycle just lumps everything into one big lump, so you don't get that element of resolution. And this is the sort of top level, and it will produce a set of information. It'll do an analysis of the reductions for each of the different categories. It produces some pretty pictures. So it'll do various different output charts that you can then drop into reports. Again, I haven't put a lot of data into this, so this is also empty, but it'll provide that sort of graphing function. And it covers quite a lot of stuff. Now, one of the things this covers actually, which I've noticed that Julie's Bicycle doesn't, which is a bit of an omission, is what they call equipment usage. And this is quite important because one of the things that's a cause of carbon emissions is things like purchasing computers or purchasing other equipment you're going to use. So in here it's got things like heaters and desk lamps and projectors and kettles and irons, which I guess you probably need if you've got costumes in your collection and this sort of thing. And the Julie's Bicycle approach would just be that if this was the year you bought new computers, all of the carbon for those computers would appear on your carbon emissions for this year, which isn't really a fair way of doing it. And what this tool does, which is a bit more sophisticated, is it says, what did you use this year? What's the typical life of that piece of equipment? And therefore it spreads its carbon impact over its useful life. And so instead of getting big lumps every time you renew some bit of equipment, if you go back to the analogy with financial accounting, it's the difference between cash accounting and accounting for things on an amortization basis. And it does provide a much more useful tool, because if you're looking at your carbon reporting over several years and one year there's a big lump and you say, well, what was that? And you say, well, that's when we bought new computers. that's not really helping you to manage your ongoing operations. Whereas actually, if you're doing it on this sort of spread out basis, I think that's a more useful way of doing it. So there are sort of slight wrinkles of difference in the way they approach it. And then the other elements within this tool, that's the sort of headline top level spreadsheet. And then there are a number of other spreadsheets that sit behind it. So they've got a thing which is called the Quick Carbon Footprint Calculator, which is designed for you to look at carbon reduction planning. So you're going to say, well, what are you going to be doing? What's the impact going to be? And it helps you to plan the sort of forecast energy reduction of that initiative. And that also can go on to one of these sorts of carbon budgeting tools. And this is where you actually say, I've got Department A, Department B, Department C, and each of them needs to have a carbon budget set. And I'm then going to track the activity of the different areas of the business. And again, I hope you can see that if you've got a thing where at the end of the year you do one sum for the whole organization that says this is what your carbon was, that doesn't really help you to see where the opportunities are for improvement, or to actually get individual responsibility to be taken by different areas within your organization to reduce carbon. And if you can break it down by groups so that different areas have got their own responsibility, then it starts to make more sense. And the empowering people, it's something I covered in the first session, but empowering people within your organization to feel they can make a difference and that the difference they make will be recognized is one of the key things to actually get things to change. So if, for example, on your heating, you've just got one number for the whole organization that is heating, then people in different areas of the organization may not feel they've got any influence over that. But if it's possible to start breaking that down and looking at different areas and providing information on how a particular area has managed to save money by reducing its energy use or reducing its electricity bills or paid attention and turned all the lights out, and they get some credit for that in the way in which the carbon reporting comes out, that's really helpful to encourage different groups to do their bit. And so this has a tool that you can then set out what you think the budget should be. I mean, the same is true for things like travel. If you've got different groups within an organization that have their own travel budget for finance, then they really ought to have their own travel budget for carbon as well. So that when they're looking at booking travel, they're thinking not just about have we got the money to pay for the tickets or to pay for the expense claim, but also have we chosen a means of travel that fits within our annual carbon budget and is improving on what we did the previous year. So I think that there are some benefits of this, but it is quite spreadsheety, and not everyone is happy with using spreadsheets. So I think that's one to explore. The links to these are on the presentation. So I'm going to just stop the share again there, and then I'm going to try and go back into my presentation if I can. And then you've all disappeared again. Let's find where you've gone again. There you are. I can be better at this share screen. Share that screen.
John,
that worked.
Can you kind of,
yeah.
If you prefer one element, say, of Julie's Bicycle, but then another element of the Creative Scotland tools, do they stand alone? So do they always use the same factors, or can you like
yes,
mix
they
and
use
match?
the same
use
factors.
A bit from one, a bit from the other.
Indeed, you can. And if you're reporting through Arts Council and they want you to do Julie's Bicycle return, there's nothing to stop you using the Gallery Climate Coalition tool to do all your general tracking and managing and all that sort of stuff. And then at the end of the year, just use at the bottom of each page on Julie's Bicycle, there's a box where you can just put your own stuff in. So you can take the output from the Gallery Climate Coalition tool and just drop it in one on each page. So you've only got to put in like 6 data points, okay. And then Julie's Bicycle will report it.
Just to clarify something,
and you could pick and choose. You could choose one for one and one for the other.
Okay, and we've got a slight confusion. So we're not, what you're looking at is Creative Carbon Scotland. The Gallery Climate Coalition is something different, isn't it?
Oh,
So
I've given it the wrong title.
yeah, just so no one gets confused. The Gallery Climate Coalition is another carbon calculator. So this is more specifically for big exhibitions. So it's been developed by galleries, mostly in the US, I think, but people are now using it. So if you've got a big exhibition you're putting on, that's quite a good one for those big one-off exhibitions.
Yeah, sorry, that should say Creative Carbon Scotland there. I'll correct that before I issue the slides. The link is the correct link, but yeah, you're quite right. Apologies for that. And in fact, the one that it's actually on the next slide. That's what I've just got ahead on the slide. So the links are correct for the right things. Creative Carbon Scotland is on the next slide. I hadn't clicked on to the next slide to actually find it. But yeah, so all the things I've been saying are true, but it's Creative Carbon Scotland is the tool that we're talking about. Yeah, you're right. The Gallery Climate Coalition is a very simple one. It just does what we've talked about, and it's really set up mostly for doing an event or an exhibition as a one-off activity. And the last of the spreadsheets I was showing under the Creative Carbon Scotland basically does the same job as that, but a bit better, I would say. So yeah, so those are the two main calculators, and I in my view, really, it comes down to a choice between Creative Carbon Scotland and Julie's Bicycle. And it's, yeah, I mean, I'm an engineer and I like spreadsheets. So for me, Julie's Bicycle is like pulling my own teeth out without anesthetic. But you may find it's more user friendly and easier to use. I also prefer to use things where I can see their workings a bit and I understand where the numbers have come from. And with Julie's Bicycle, you've no idea how although they do provide a document that shows you all the methodology, it's really not very transparent and it's not always clear what they've done. And the thing I get frustrated with Julie's Bicycle because really they're quite a large organization and they're quite well funded. And you'd think they would have progressed more and become more sophisticated and be offering better tools for things like carbon tracking and running projects, carbon improvement, and being more sophisticated in the way in which they analyze, the sort of data. And we're going to come on to that as a sort of last bit in the last sort of quarter of an hour, just to talk about the elements of how this can be used to drive change. So if we just trundle on, just very quickly, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but there's a whole range of tools that exist commercially, and really all the commercial tools. I mean, obviously you've got to pay for them, which is a bit of a downer, but also they're generally trying to offer ways of integrating the reporting into business operations to reduce the amount of overhead that's needed to drive them. And some of these ones like Greenly and Sphera and Persephone are really quite sophisticated tools that are fully integrated into the accounting system. So that, in a sort of big business, if you wanted to buy something, doing it through an automated accounting system, it pops up with various things you've got to complete, and then you've got to send it for approvals around some sort of business flow. All of that has got the carbon elements built into it as well. So those are designed really to enable a big organization to be managing carbon in a robust way without adding a lot of overhead and creating a whole lot of new work for people to do in order to meet that need. But I mean, if you're interested and want to have a dip a toe in to see what some of the things that are going on, some of these are really very sophisticated and are very much embedded into the way that organizations are starting to operate. And as I say, you should take that as being very encouraging, because there's a lot of big corporations that are really getting to grips with their carbon reductions and driving the right behaviors. So we've had a bit of toing and froing on that, and I'm aware that we haven't got a lot of time left, and I'm quite keen just to take you through these last few examples of how carbon management can help improve carbon. But are there any pressing questions on that bit? I mean, I'm aware that this isn't intended to be a sort of teaching session as how to use the Julie's Bicycle tool, for example. I mean, you could spend half a day just taking you through the detail of that, but it is relatively self-explanatory, and of course they themselves provide training as to how to use their own tools. But, yeah.
I put up a link on the chat to the webinar that they have. There's an online webinar that was recorded last year that has all goes through it.
And to be fair to them, they're coming at it from the point of view that they're trying to make it accessible to people who don't want to come on a session to learn all about what carbon emissions are and where they come from and how to do the maths, but just want to get to the answer. So, and from that point of view, I think they do a pretty good job with that. I just wish they'd do it slightly better. What I wanted to do just at the end of the session was just to talk about how, just try and get you to think about how this can be used to drive improvements in carbon emissions. Because if all we're doing is reporting what happened after the end of the year, it's too late to do anything about it, really, isn't it? If it's that late. And what we want to do is to start to use the assessment of the carbon impact of what we're doing to help change the actions we're taking, to help influence the decisions we're taking. So I've just got 3 examples of the ways in which organisations are starting to build carbon management into their decision making. So I've just picked 3 examples, which are these are all real world examples of things that are actually being done by organisations. So the first one is thinking about one of the things is that your employee commute is part of your Scope 3 emissions, and for reporting, this is actually a real world organisation. What they were doing was they were calculating the emissions from commuting just by making an assumption about what the average commute distance was, and assuming that for everybody that was doing more than 2-mile distance, they were in a medium-sized car, and just adding it up on that basis. And to be fair, the answer they got wasn't wrong. It wasn't an accurate estimate, but it wasn't something that enabled them to do anything about behaviours or encourage people to behave differently. So what they moved to is they moved to a system where they calculated the carbon based on each individual employee's commute. So within the HR system, basically what they did is they linked the sum to the HR system, and also quite cleverly to the security system. So the system then knew for each individual how far they were coming and what was their normal means of transport. And if they logged in, if they clocked in at the beginning of the day, it ticked up and said, right, you've just travelled to work, and I'm going to assume you're going to go home again afterwards. But if you were working from home, or if you were away on holiday, or if you were away on business, then it didn't tick over and it didn't count that carbon. So that is just improving the accuracy. But what was clever about it is they then set up a self-service portal where people could go onto it and say, today I came on my bike, or today I used the bus. And it would then log that they hadn't used their normal mode of transport, and it would start to make a difference. And also, if people changed their car, they could go onto the system and say, I know I used to drive a Range Rover, but I've just bought an electric car. And that would also be logged on. And it then rewarded people just with recognition. There wasn't any money attached to it, but it gave people a score, and people got recognised each month for having had the biggest improvement in their travel carbon. And you can see that immediately, by measuring it in a slightly more sophisticated way, you can actually keep track of improvements and motivate people to change and motivate improvement. Whereas when it was just all averaged up, there was nothing to distinguish between. So yeah, so that's one example. I think I've got 3 which I'm going to just share with you, and there's loads of others, but I think these are all ones that might have some relevance. So in terms of business travel, if you've got people that are going off to meetings or going off to conferences or whatever, again, the sort of standard approach of just measuring it at the end of the year would be that you'd stick the travel into the Mystic portal, and Julie's bicycle would do the sums, and it would tell you what the emissions were. But again, it's not really affecting behaviour. And as I was saying earlier, what you really want to do is have for each department or group or whatever, a travel carbon budget that you agree at the beginning of the year. And then when you book a travel and you say, I'm going to go, on the train to Manchester, or I'm going to, drive down to, Somerset or whatever. When you're booking it, it actually asks you where you're going to, and what your means of travel is, and it then says, well, that's going to use X much out of your budget. Is that the right thing to do? And it may well be that you're looking at it and thinking, oh, that's a bit tricky. I'm now very tight on my carbon budget. I better go on the train, which might cost more money. But then you're balancing the different parameters. So rather than just making a decision on what's the quickest route or what's the cheapest route, you're also building into that decision what's the carbon impact of that route. And I think you can see that then suddenly you're changing the way in which people are making decisions and encouraging them to think about the carbon impact. And also, if you're measuring it and you're tracking it, that again is encouraging people to keep tabs on that important parameter on carbon emissions. So that's quite a that's another way in which you're moving away from just annual reporting to active management. And a sort of a similar but parallel one is when you're buying things and thinking about how they get delivered. Your things like stationery, or if you're buying stationery, are you buying it in an efficient way? Are you sort of just buying bits and pieces every week, so the delivery van turns up once a week with a stapler and three erasers and some pencils, and the next week it turns up with some paper, and the next week it turns up? Or are you actually grouping deliveries, and are you thinking about that? And that comes down again to a similar thing, really, where you've got a procurement carbon budget, and when you're sourcing products, you're asking about the delivery means, you're asking about the carbon. So you're not just thinking about cost. And also, if you're doing it as part of the purchasing process, what businesses are doing is when they're doing that sort of purchase requisition process internally, where they've got to sign off to say, yes, they've got approval to buy it, they're actually recording the carbon emissions at that point. So it means that in real time, effectively, as you're committing to buy things, that's going against your carbon budget in just the same way as it's going against your financial budget. And that then means that you've got some visibility of where you are against where you ought to be, or what your improvement targets are, and whether you're on track to meet the year-end targets in terms of carbon emissions. And so moving away from this thing of just retrospectively reporting on something long after it happened, towards trying to capture the data at the point at which you make the decision, so that if it's going to be a decision that's going to be bad for your carbon, you know about it and you can maybe make a different decision, is a really key part of the next stage of moving forward with the sort of carbon management. So that's a lot of information. Apologies for the various technical issues. And I hope you managed to pick some of that up along the way. Are there any sort of final questions? We are going to have this next session in a few weeks' time. What I'd like to ask people to do is actually to go away and have a look at the tools, have a play with them, try them out, so that what we can do at the session in a few weeks' time is actually deal with any issues that come up. Once you've actually been on there and used it, you might be completely baffled by something, or just not see how to do something. And that's what we can use that next session to look at, if that makes sense.
I've just put up the link to the Gallery Climate Coalition as well. But I'll ask Charlotte to send out the links when she sends you out the evaluation.
Yeah, they are embedded in the presentation. Each of those headings is a link. So it's when we send that around. Yeah. I'd only confused myself by not being on the right slide rather than I'd forgotten that it was all on the next slide, and I'd confused myself. But yeah. Any other immediate burning issues that have occurred to people?
Only slightly concerned about how much time this is all going to take to get to grips with. It looks like a lot of work.
And I suppose that if you look at Julie's Bicycle, then you'll find that actually doing just an annual report is reasonably quick if you're just aggregating everything up. Whereas if you're trying to put every single individual journey in one at a time, you know, at the end of the year, that becomes a bit more of a pain. And I think that the point about their spreadsheet approach is that it's the sort of thing where you can have the spreadsheet on a shared drive, and when anybody goes anywhere, they have to fill that in for themselves when they do it. And then by the end of the year, that's built up into a data set, so that you're not having to do one big exercise once a year. Actually, you're building the data up as you go.
Yeah, I'll have to do that for this year because it's the first year. But I think, yeah, absolutely, you've got to have the tools there that everybody can access to do it themselves. Otherwise, this is, you know, could get out of hand.
Indeed, and bear in mind that, you know, when you're looking at, if you're doing it for the first time for the whole year, you haven't actually got to put every individual journey in separately, because actually the one thing with Julie's Bicycle tool is it doesn't distinguish between different sorts of cars and things. So actually all you need to do is work through all the journeys, add it up to a total number of miles, and just put it in as one line and just say all company, you know, all business, all, you know, all sort of museum travel was this many miles in a car, and this many miles on a train, and this many miles on a. So you can that way you don't have to do lots of data entry, but you do need to sort of realistically estimate what the travel distances were.
Yeah. It looks like it's done on a calendar year rather than a financial year. Is that right?
I think you can choose.
I
think okay. I think there's an option. Yeah.
Okay.
The Scottish one is set up by default as a financial year.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, we will wrap it up there. Don't forget about the session on the 27th of February if you've got your questions. If you can't make it, do email me questions and John will reply directly to you. If you're going to come along, would you sign up on Eventbrite for it, please? There are other sessions running related to this and environmental responsibility in general. So do have a look at Eventbrite for various other things. We've got a session on transport coming up in March or April. That's one on audiences as well. So yeah, keep an eye out for everything that is advertised on Eventbrite and also on the Share newsletter and on Twitter, etc. But apart from that, thank you all very much for coming. I found it really interesting. It's quite nice sometimes to do something involving figures. I find work a different part of the brain, get that going. And thanks very much, John. It was really informative. We will make the recording available and I will send it out to you all. Apart from that, you are free to go and get your lunch. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks.